The first light of morning in Brooklyn filtered through the narrow alleys and tenement windows, soft yet sharp, touching the brick walls with a kind of hesitant curiosity. It was the sort of light that seemed to pause before it fully arrived, lingering on damp sidewalks and the flickering metal of fire escapes. In this city, in these streets, many people still think that a child's path is determined solely by choice. But what does the quiet persistence of circumstance tell us? Shadows settled over the neighborhood like a patient teacher, teaching lessons that few adults acknowledged but which every child absorbed. On that spring morning of 1897, in a cramped apartment above a butcher shop, Salvatore Lucania, later known to the world as Lucky Luciano, stirred from his sleep. The sound of his own breath mingling with the distant clatter of horse-drawn carts and the muted cries of vendors. The apartment smelled of bread, damp wool, and the faint tank of iron. From the street below, his mother, Rosalia, moved silently across the worn floorboards, carrying a bowl of watered-down coffee, and the scent of frying onions from the kitchen beneath reminded him of the rhythm of domestic life. Constant, fragile, and often brittle. His father, a man of quiet temper and meticulous habits, read the morning papers, the ink smudging his fingers slightly as he turned each page. Brooklyn, at this time, was a tapestry of immigrant lives, tightly packed, vibrant, and constrained. The streets were alive with the chatter of Italian, Yiddish, and Irish accents. Many people still think that neighborhoods shape children merely by their architecture or proximity to poverty. Yet, one might ask, is it the streets themselves or the human stories within them that imprint on a young mind? Let's anchor this with a historical fact. In 1900, Brooklyn was home to over 1 million residents, the majority living in densely populated tenements. Law enforcement was uneven, often corrupt, and social mobility was a fragile dream for the children of immigrants. Italian families, like the Lucanias, were negotiating survival and identity in a city that valued profit over patience. Economic hardship was omnipresent. Small jobs, odd trades, and relentless manual labor defined daily life. For a boy of 5, these realities were absorbed unconsciously in the texture of the streets, in the hardened faces of adults, and in the quiet tension that followed whispered conversations in dimly lit hallways. Salvatore's early world was not one of grand events, but of micro. He watched the butcher shop below, noting how the men handled knives with precision, how the weight of authority was carried in the quietest gestures. He noticed the interactions of neighbors, their nods and brief smiles, the subtle dances of trust and avoidance that marked survival. There's a story that, even as a child, Luciano would follow these minute rhythms with an almost meditative attention, absorbing lessons that words alone could not convey. He was learning, though silently, that influence did not always roar. Sometimes it lingered in the shape of shadows stretching across cobblestone streets at dawn. By the age of 7, Salvatore's curiosity had already taken the form of observation, mixed with a careful imitation of those around him. School offered its own structural world of routines, rules, and small hierarchies, but the streets whispered more persistently. Many people still think that education alone shapes ambition, yet the boy found that lessons in arithmetic and spelling were only a fraction of what he was learning about power, loyalty, and discretion. The way neighbors exchanged glances when a police officer passed, the sudden hush in a bar when certain men entered, the silent contracts of recognition, all these patterns impressed upon him a deep, almost philosophical understanding of human behavior. The spring rains came soft and grey, soaking the streets and creating puddles that reflected the stoops and signs above them. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint aroma of coal smoke, an olfactory symphony that reminded any observer of the city's pulse. Young Salvatore walked carefully along these streets, feet splashing in shallow pools, mind cataloguing faces and reactions, timing gestures and pauses as if they were notes in an elaborate composition. His childhood, like the dawn itself, was tentative yet insistent, filled with the tension of potential energy. He noticed that people's eyes often betrayed their intentions before words did. He noted patterns in conflict and resolution, in avoidance and confrontation. Every small observation became a brick in a mental architecture that would later support an empire of influence and control. Psychologically, this early environment instilled in him a nuanced approach to trust. He learned to value information, not for its content but for its subtle delivery. He learned that loyalty was never absolute and that appearances were often a prelude to reality. He absorbed the contradictions of human behavior, the simultaneous kindness and harshness, the protective gestures mixed with unspoken threats. Many people still think that a child's innocence shields them from complexity. So, what do you think? Does innocence persist, or does the mind, even at a young age, begin to negotiate reality quietly, patiently, like shadows lengthening at dusk? In these early years, lucky Luciano also developed a rhythm of attention that combined patience with acute awareness. He noted repetition in behavior and drew patterns from ordinary actions. He observed the roles of adults, their small compromises, their subtle manipulations, began to experiment with minor tests of authority, harmless provocations that revealed character. His relationship with his parents, particularly with his mother, was a mixture of warmth and caution, a delicate balance of affection and control that mirrored the broader social negotiations he witnessed outside. The lessons were soft, almost imperceptible, but enduring. By late morning, the city settled into a quieter rhythm. Horse hooves clattered less frequently, and the bakers' carts had delivered their morning bread. The sun, breaking fully through the haze, gilded the edges of the tenements with a gentle warmth. Salvatore paused at a window, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the stoops below, noticing how even in motion there was stillness, and in noise there was an underlying calm. He exhaled, softening into the patterns of his world, absorbing the quiet lessons the streets offered, readying himself for another day of observation, learning, and subtle negotiation with the life around him. As dawn surrendered to morning, the gentle sounds of Brooklyn, the creaking of doors, the soft chatter of neighbors, the distant rumble of carts created a lull that invited reflection and rest. For the young boy who would become Lucky Luciano, these early experiences were foundational, an immersion into a living tapestry of human behavior, an apprenticeship in patience, observation, and the quiet accumulation of insight. Shadows over Brooklyn at dawn were not merely the absence of light. They were the shapes of learning, the contours of potential, the soft architecture of a mind attuning itself to the rhythms of a complex, unforgiving world. And so, as the city breathed and exhaled its mist and light, we leave Salvatore there, absorbing, noticing, contemplating the shadows of dawn settling gently over him, shaping the contours of a mind that would one day navigate influence, power, and survival with a subtlety both precise and relentless. Settle now, breathe, soften, and drift alongside the quiet morning, where even in the most crowded streets there is a space for reflection, observation, and the slow unfolding of human understanding. The early autumn air in Brooklyn carried a faint chill tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and the ever-present aroma of coal smoke drifting from the brick chimneys. Salvatore Lucania, now 8 years old, walked through the narrow lanes toward PS9, the school where the wooden doors creaked like whispers and the hallways smelled faintly of chalk, dust, and damp coats. Children shuffled past him, their voices carrying fragments of Italian, Yiddish, and English, a polyphony of the city's immigrant life. Many people still think that school is the primary place where lessons of discipline and social order are learned. So, what do you think? Is it the formal curriculum that shapes a child, or the silent negotiations in crowded corridors, the subtle rules of observation and response? Shadows stretched long along the walls as morning sun fought to penetrate the narrow windows, illuminating the patterns of peeling paint and scratched desks. Salvatore's eyes tracked every movement, noting the shifts in posture, the half-hidden glances exchanged between classmates, the subtle signs of favor and avoidance. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1905, Brooklyn public schools were overcrowded, with student-tutor ratios often exceeding 50-1. Teachers, overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, relied on rote methods and corporal punishment to maintain control. Discipline was strict, uniformity demanded, and deviation observed with suspicion. For a boy of Salvatore's temperament, these conditions provided a backdrop for early lessons in risk assessment, attention to detail, and the understanding that authority could be tested, but only carefully. His teachers, weary and abrupt, seemed to embody the very contradictions of the city, firm, yet inconsistent, watchful yet distracted, a reflection of the adult world he was beginning to map in his mind. During recess, Salvatore wandered the cracked asphalt yard, noting the clusters of boys and girls, the subtle hierarchies that governed who played with whom and who avoided whom. There's a story that he learned early on to measure his presence, to step lightly where tension hovered, to test the edges of friendship and influence without drawing notice. He observed the way certain children yielded to others, the almost imperceptible cues that indicated dominance or submission. He began to replicate these behaviors in small ways, experimenting with speech, posture, and timing. His small acts of mimicry were never purely playful. They were careful calibrations, early exercises in influence and perception. Salvatore's family life intersected with these lessons. At home, his mother continued to instill manners, a sense of duty, and cautious respect for elders, while his father emphasized practicality, precision, and a quiet pride in work well done. Many people still think that parental guidance is straightforward, that lessons are conveyed only in words. Yet the boy absorbed the rhythms, silences, and contradictions of adult behavior, internalizing patterns that would later guide his decisions in more complex, morally ambiguous environments. The kitchen table, the neighborhood stoop, the corner store became arenas of observation and subtle learning. In the classroom, the physical environment mirrored the psychological terrain. Desks were rigid, arranged in straight rows, forcing conformity, while the high windows offered glimpses of the outside world. Streets, alleys, and rooftops. Freedom, risk, and observation existed beyond the walls. Salvatore would often sit quietly, pencil in hand, but his attention drifted to the interactions around him. A boy taking another's lunch, a whispered argument over a small coin, the fleeting expressions of fear or defiance. Each observation was a lesson in strategy and human behavior, absorbed in a soft, almost meditative focus. Psychologically, these years fostered a dual awareness in him, the conscious and the unconscious, the visible and the hidden. He learned that people reveal more through restraint than through speech, that silence can communicate as powerfully as words. That influence often flows in subtle currents rather than overt gestures. Many people still think that childhood is a time of innocence untainted by calculation. So, what do you think? Do children merely imitate, or do they internalize, analyze, and adapt to the complex social structures surrounding them? For Salvatore, the playground was both classroom and laboratory, a space where early moral and social codes were tested and refined, a space where shadows whispered lessons more potent than any lecture. During winter months, the school corridors, filled with the scent of wet wool and the faint tang of coal smoke that filtered from nearby factories. Children huddled near the radiators, their cheeks flushed from cold, their voices hushed yet urgent. Salvatore moved among them with a careful awareness, gauging reactions, anticipating movements, and quietly asserting a presence without drawing overt attention. There's a story that he learned to combine observation with small, calculated gestures, sharing a pencil, offering a nod. A subtle smile that earned trust and compliance in ways adults rarely noticed. These early experiments in influence and perception were shaping a young mind capable of reading situations with precision, gauging risks, and adapting rapidly. As the day drew to a close, the low sun painted the walls in amber and gold, casting long, soft shadows across the hallways and courtyards. Salvatore lingered at the window, watching the streets come alive with returning laborers, vendors closing shops, and children trailing home through puddled sidewalks. He exhaled, softening, into the rhythm of the evening, letting the observations settle quietly in his mind. The shadows beneath the schoolyard walls had taught him patience, awareness, and the nuanced dance of social hierarchy lessons that would later underpin his navigation of more complex, adult worlds. And so, as dusk deepened and the city exhaled a muted sigh, Salvatore returned home, small steps echoing softly along familiar streets, the warmth of the apartment, the faint aroma of evening meals, the low murmur of family conversational contributed to a gentle closing of the day. The lessons of the schoolyard, though subtle, had taken root, folded into the patterns of thought and behavior that would guide him for years to come. The whispers beneath those walls were not just echoes of childhood. They were the early architecture of perception, patience, and strategic thinking. Settle now, breathe, soften, and allow the quiet rhythm of Brooklyn evenings to fold around the mind, where shadows, whispers, and gentle observation linger to guide the sleeper toward rest. The late afternoon sun slanted between the brick tenements of Brooklyn, throwing long, narrow shadows across the uneven sidewalks. The air carried the mingled scents of coal smoke, baked bread, and the faint tents of the East River drifting from a distance. Salvatore Lucania, now nearing 10, walked with a measured step, his eyes tracing the patterns of movement in alleys, stoops, and street corners. Many people still think that childhood is a time of innocence, untouched by consequence. So, what? Do you think, is innocence a shield, or does it quietly erode under the weight of observation and circumstance? The city itself seemed alive with lessons for those who knew how to notice: a shopkeeper's guarded glance, a man shifting uneasily when a stranger approached, the subtle exchange of coins and gestures in shadowed doorways. These streets were both playground and teacher, whispering truths that textbooks could never convey. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1907, Brooklyn was a densely populated hub of immigrant families, with Italian neighborhoods particularly crowded along streets such as Navy Street and Montague Avenue. Children often roamed freely, observing adult transactions and learning unspoken social codes. Law enforcement was inconsistent, local police forces struggling with limited manpower and widespread corruption. The presence of authorities was intermittent, often more of a suggestion than a guarantee of order. In this environment, Salvatore learned to read the unspoken language of small gestures, pauses, and expressions that hinted at power, trust, and the boundaries of tolerance. He noticed, for example, how even minor confrontations were resolved not by shouting but by subtle posturing, timing, and awareness of audience. That afternoon, he paused near a small corner store where a group of older boys had gathered. There's a story that he watched them with careful curiosity, noting the hierarchy in play, the fleeting signals that dictated who led and who followed. He observed a young man with a sharp gaze directing the others, and Salvatore studied the way authority could be conveyed without words. He began to imitate these patterns in small ways, a deliberate gesture, a careful pause before speaking, a glance that measured attention and reaction. In the silent streets, lessons in influence and timing became as essential as reading or arithmetic. At home, his mother continued to provide structure and warmth. Yet the apartment above the butcher shop felt smaller, tighter, as if the weight of the neighborhood pressed inward. Many people still think that family alone determines character. So, what do you think? Does the street teach more subtly than parental guidance, or do both intertwine in shaping perception and decision-making? Salvatore navigated both worlds with acute awareness. At the table, he learned patience and negotiation, observing his father's meticulous approach to work and his mother's careful management of household relationships. Outside, he learned observation, calculation, and adaptation. The combination fostered a growing complexity in thought, a mind balancing instinct and reflection, patience and initiative. The streets were colder now, as winter approached, carrying the tang of wet asphalt and coal smoke. Salvatore trailed along Navy Street, absorbing the muted rhythm of daily life. There's a story that he began to test boundaries in subtle ways, small acts of defiance, brief trespasses into forbidden corners, calculated movements that elicited reactions from older boys. He learned quickly that action without observation could be costly, while subtle experimentation allowed him to measure responses without exposure. These early engagements, while minor in scale, were formative exercises in timing, perception, and the delicate balance between risk and caution. Psychologically, this period developed in him a dual consciousness, awareness of the environment, an introspection of self. He learned that trust is earned incrementally and that perception often outweighs intention. He noted contradictions in human behavior, the simultaneous kindness and suspicion, generosity and jealousy, and began cataloging these observations internally, a mental ledger of human dynamics. Many people still think that children act purely, impulsively. So, what do you think? Can early, deliberate observation cultivate foresight and strategy even before adolescence? For Salvatore, the answer manifested in quiet attentiveness and carefully measured experimentation, laying the groundwork for understanding power, influence, and human motivation. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, the lamplight flickered along the edges of stoops and alleyways. The city exhaled, a soft susurration of distant voices, creaking shutters, and muted footsteps. Salvatore lingered at a corner, observing a minor scuffle among older boys, noting reactions, choices, and outcomes. He exhaled, allowing the evening's lessons to integrate silently, a mental mosaic of timing, influence, and awareness. Shadows lengthened, softening the contours of buildings and streets, and the subtle symphony of nightfall invited reflection. By the time he reached home, the warmth of the apartment, the faint aroma of evening meals, and the low murmur of family conversation welcomed him. The silent streets of Brooklyn had offered first sparks early exercises in understanding human behavior, subtle negotiations of power, and the nascent architecture of influence. These experiences, quiet and understated, had begun to shape the contours of Salvatore's mind, preparing him for the intricate web of relationships, observation, and strategy that would define his later life. Settle now, breathe, soften, and let the gentle fading light of Brooklyn dusk fold around the mind, where silent streets and whispered lessons linger to guide the sleeper toward rest. The city of Brooklyn carried a quiet tension as night descended, streets narrowing beneath the heavy shadows of tenement blocks and the flicker of gas lamps that cast trembling circles of light onto the sidewalks. Salvatore Lucania, now approaching 12, moved through these alleys with the careful attention of a mind attuned to detail. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp brick, coal smoke, and faintly of laundry drying in open windows. Many people still think that a child's early environment teaches only what is spoken aloud. So, what do you think? Can silence and observation carry lessons deeper than words? The narrow streets, the clatter of shutters, and the distant murmur of a carriage moving along cobbled avenues provided a living classroom. Shadows pooled and shifted, revealing more than the eye initially perceived. Signals in posture, gestures, and pauses that spoke of hierarchy, trust, and cautious negotiation. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1909, Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods were densifying rapidly. Families like the Lucanias lived in close quarters, often above small businesses or shops, and children routinely learned the unspoken rules of social interaction by observation. Law enforcement remained patchy, corruption was widespread, and community vigilance often replaced official oversight. This combination created a subtle social training ground. Children learned that survival and influence often depended on reading the invisible currents of power in their neighborhoods. Salvatore's movements, his attentiveness to expressions and reactions, were quietly molding him into a perceptive observer, capable of discerning patterns invisible to most. He began to understand that authority could be negotiated, not merely imposed, and that influence often flowed along unspoken channels rather than overt commands. Nights were particularly instructive. The alleys, empty except for the occasional passerby or stray dog, became laboratories for testing observation and initiative. There's a story that Salvatore would shadow older boys, watching how they conducted themselves in the quieter hours, noting how they approached small exchanges, settled disputes, and established informal hierarchies. He experimented with minor interventions, softly redirecting a conversation, offering small gestures that earned trust, and observing the ripple effect of subtle influence. Each night, each shadowed street corner provided lessons that textbooks could never impart, exercises in judgment, timing, and the careful management of presence. At home, Rosalia continued to enforce routines, meals punctuated by the sound of cutlery on plates, whispered instructions to younger siblings, and quiet negotiations with her husband over the day's expenditures. Many people still think that discipline alone defines childhood morality. So, what do you think? Does structure imposed from above outweigh the subtle curriculum of streets and observation? Salvatore absorbed both the warmth and ritual of home life and the meticulous, almost silent education provided by Brooklyn's shadowed streets. He began to understand the duality of trust. It was simultaneously fragile and instrumental, a currency in interactions both familial and social. The winter wind began to seep through cracks in the buildings, carrying the metallic tang of frost and the faint smoke of distant factories. Salvatore learned to read the city in layers, the outer layer of movement and speech, the middle of gestures and expression, and the inner, almost imperceptible, current of intention. There's a story that he took particular note of hesitation, micro-pauses that hinted at fear, calculation, or deceit. He experimented with his own timing in response, learning that even slight adjustments in demeanor could subtly influence outcomes. These exercises, though quiet and unnoticed, shaped a keen, strategic sense, an awareness of human behavior that would underpin his future capacity to navigate complex networks of influence. Psychologically, this period nurtured an emerging dual: consciousness, awareness of the environment, and reflection on self. A mind constantly mapping relationships, potential outcomes, and subtle cues. Salvatore noted the contradictions in adults and peers alike: simultaneous generosity and suspicion, assertiveness mixed with insecurity. Many people still think that children absorb morality only from rules. So, what do you think? Might perception, observation, and early experimentation cultivate a practical understanding of social dynamics just as vital as formal instruction? For Salvatore, the quiet nights and careful attentiveness cultivated patience, strategic thinking, and the subtle management of interpersonal currents, forming the earliest architecture of influence and foresight. By the time the city had settled into a deeper quiet, the flickering street lamps casting slow-moving shadows across doorways and stoops, Salvatore returned to the apartment above the butcher shop. The smell of supper mingled with the warmth of home, offering a comforting contrast to the chill of the streets. Shadows had taught him their own language, lessons in timing, trust, and perception, while the routine of domestic life offered structure and grounding. The duality of these experiences, home and street, observation and reflection, was molding a young mind capable of measuring consequences and intentions with precision. As he lay in bed, the faint sounds of distant footsteps, the creak of shutters, and the soft sigh of the wind through narrow streets offered a lullaby of subtle lessons. The city exhaled, and Salvatore, exhaling with it, softened into the rhythms of his environment, absorbing the silent curriculum of the streets and the whispered codes of human interaction. In these nights, he was learning the first truths of influence, patience, observation, and the quiet mastery of presence. Settle now, breathe, and allow the gentle Brooklyn night to fold around the mind, where shadows and soft whispers linger to guide the sleeper toward calm and rest. The winter sun in Brooklyn sank low, casting a muted orange glow over the narrow streets. The brick facades softened by frost and the subtle haze of chimney smoke curling into the pale sky. Salvatore Lucania, now 14, moved with a measured gait through the familiar alleys, his coat buttoned tightly against the sharp bite of February air. Many people still think that adolescence is merely a time of rebellion or play. So, what do you think? Could it instead be the moment when observation transforms into deliberate learning, when subtle patterns are recognized and tested? The city was alive with quiet instruction, the careful nods of men in doorways, the measured pacing of merchants closing their shops, the hushed conversations carried in curt glances across dimly lit streets. Each movement, each sound, was a lesson in navigation, hierarchy, and timing. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1911, Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods were crowded, and adolescent boys often found themselves on the streets after school hours, navigating social hierarchies while assisting family trades or engaging in small-scale errands. Organized crime was beginning to take a more structured shape, with older figures establishing footholds in neighborhoods. Law enforcement remained sporadic, sometimes indifferent, often corrupt, leaving gaps that local youths observed and, consciously or not, learned from. Salvatore, moving through this environment, began walking beside older boys, quietly studying their movements, listening to the cadence of their interactions, and noting the subtle negotiations of respect, compliance, and influence. There's a story that he began seeking out the company of those who held informal authority. In his immediate surroundings, men who commanded quiet attention, who were respected for precision and prudence rather than sheer force. He observed their habits, the way they paused in conversation, measured their words, noted reactions, and kept subtle control over their domains. Small tasks and errands became exercises in observation and discreet participation, delivering messages, observing neighborhood interactions, and occasionally testing boundaries under the careful watch of older figures. Each act, no matter how minor, was recorded and analyzed in his mind. At home, the rhythms of family life continued with steady persistence. His mother managed the household with a quiet authority, instilling routines, while his father emphasized diligence, calculation, and a careful attention to detail. Many people still think that mentoring only occurs through formal instruction. So, what do you think? Could the silent influence of experienced figures, modeled behavior, and subtle observation carry lessons as potent as words? Salvatore absorbed both the structured domesticity at home and the practical, unspoken curriculum of the streets. These combined influences fostered a developing strategic awareness and a sense of timing, essential for navigating human networks. The winter air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of coal and damp streets. Salvatore moved alongside older boys, absorbing lessons in patience, subtlety, and influence. There's a story that he learned to listen more than he spoke, to notice pauses and gestures that betrayed intent, and to time his actions with precision. Small, calculated acts, a nod, a whispered response. The choice of where to stand became instruments of understanding, early exercises in influence that required both observation and restraint. These lessons were not taught in classrooms. They were absorbed in the quiet rhythms of the city and the measured example of experienced figures. Psychologically, this period cultivated an early sense of social calculus, a recognition that power could be negotiated, that respect was earned through timing and perception, and that influence often resided in subtle, nearly invisible movements rather than overt assertion. Salvatore noted contradictions, generosity paired with suspicion, authority accompanied by insecurity, careful planning shadowed by impulsive action. Many people still think that adolescence is chaotic and unstructured. So, what do you think? Could the deliberate study of behavior, even at a young age, lay the groundwork for foresight and strategic thinking. For Salvatore, walking beside seasoned shadows provided precisely that foundation, a practical apprenticeship in human observation, the management of presence, and the understanding of subtle power dynamics. By late afternoon, the sun had dropped, further softening the edges of buildings and casting long, trembling shadows across streets and stoops. Salvatore returned home, carrying with him the impressions of the day, small lessons in negotiation, observation, and timing, each quietly folded into the architecture of his mind. The warmth of the apartment, the faint aroma of cooking, and the gentle murmur of family conversation provided a contrast to the cold, disciplined observation of the streets. Shadows had become teachers, experienced companions, and the early guides to a life that would demand precision, subtlety, and strategic awareness as night descended. The faint creak of shutters and the whisper of wind through narrow alleys offered a lullaby of quiet instruction. Salvatore exhaled, softening into the rhythm of the city and the gentle lessons it had offered. Walking beside seasoned shadows was no longer mere mimicry. It was an integration of observation, reflection, and practice. Settle now, breathe, and allow the quiet Brooklyn evening to fold around the mind, where subtle guidance, whispered codes, and the soft cadence of human interaction linger to encourage calm and rest. The first light of spring in Brooklyn filtered softly through the narrow streets, casting long, delicate beams across worn cobblestones and the familiar brick facades of Salvatore Lucania's neighborhood. He was now 16, and the chill of morning had begun to give way to a tempered warmth. Carrying the scent of fresh bread from corner bakeries and the faint tints of coal smoke lingering in the air. Many people still think that achievement at such a young age is merely coincidental, a matter of luck or circumstance. So, what do you think? Could early observation, patience, and careful calculation quietly accumulate into meaningful, tangible successes? Salvatore moved with a quiet confidence, noting the patterns of movement among vendors, neighbors, and older figures, tracking small gestures of acknowledgement and the subtle signals of respect or deference. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1913, Brooklyn was a densely populated urban hub, particularly for Italian immigrant communities. The economic landscape was constrained, work opportunities scarce, and organized social networks within neighborhoods often determined access to resources and influence. Law enforcement remained inconsistent, sometimes providing protection, often turning a blind eye, which left room for those who could navigate the informal rules of conduct. Salvatore, through years of careful observation and participation, began to secure small but significant victories, favors obtained, alliances observed, and tasks accomplished with a precision that garnered quiet acknowledgement from older, influential figures. These early triumphs were subtle yet formative, shaping both reputation and self-perception. There's a story that he completed errands for local shopkeepers and trusted neighborhood figures, not with haste, but with an attentiveness that impressed more than the act itself. He learned that reliability, discretion, and timing created a currency of trust, often more valuable than any tangible reward. Each successful engagement reinforced his awareness of cause and effect, of the way influence traveled along unseen lines of loyalty and observation. Many people still think that teenage success is measured only by material gain or overt recognition. So, what do you think? Might it instead be the quiet accumulation of credibility, respect, and the subtle mastery of human interaction that marks early accomplishment. The streets themselves were rich with instruction. Salvatore observed the ebb and flow of small disputes, noting how minor tensions resolved naturally without overt confrontation when timing and subtle authority were applied. He began to see patterns. Certain gestures demanded acknowledgement. Certain pauses indicated hierarchy, and even silence could assert influence. These lessons were absorbed unconsciously, quietly informing his approach to relationships and the management of presence. He learned, for example, that a nod at the right moment, or a careful positioning in conversation, could yield acknowledgement or trust without overt imposition. At home, routines provided contrast and grounding. Meals were served with quiet ceremony, his mother managing the household with deliberate care, his father emphasizing precision and responsibility in all tasks. Salvatore's triumphs were rarely boisterous. They were measured, reflective, absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of domestic and neighborhood life. Psychologically, this period reinforced an early understanding of balance, patience tempered with initiative, observation integrated with discrete action, respect earned through consistency rather than assertion. There's a story that he often reflected quietly on these small successes, noting cause, effect, and the subtle mechanics of influence. The neighborhood itself, alive with spring energy, carried lessons in motion and stillness. Street vendors arranged their goods with practiced care, children played under careful supervision, and older figures moved with deliberate gestures, asserting authority without disruption. Many people still think that power is always loud and visible. So, what do you think? Could quiet competence, reliability, and the precise reading of social currents carry authority even in the absence of force or spectacle? Salvatore was learning, day by day, to apply observation and reflection to tangible outcomes, to translate awareness into subtle achievement, and to recognize the interplay between patience, discretion, and influence. As dusk approached, the sun softened, painting the brick facades with amber tones, and the streets grew quieter, punctuated only by the distant clatter of carts and the muted chatter of neighbors returning home. Salvatore exhaled, feeling the rhythm of the neighborhood settle round him. The echoes of early triumphs embedded in the quiet acknowledgement of those who had observed his actions. The warmth of the apartment, the faint aroma of evening meals, and the soft murmur of family conversation provided a gentle closure to the day. Shadows lengthened, softening the contours of the streets, and Salvatore's mind, attuned to nuance and rhythm, absorbed the lessons in subtle influence and quiet mastery. The late afternoon sky hung low over Brooklyn. A soft haze muted the outlines of brick tenements, and the last chill of early spring lingered in the narrow alleys. Salvatore Lucania, now 17, moved through these streets with a quiet attentiveness, his coat drawn tight against the lingering wind, eyes scanning corners, stoops, and doorways for the subtle currents of human interaction. Many people still think that friendships and alliances form only through overt camaraderie. So, what do you think? Could true bonds be forged more profoundly in whispered corners, subtle gestures, and shared silences? The neighborhood, alive, with muted activity, offered instruction. Men nodding in cautious acknowledgement, children moving in measured patterns, merchants exchanging curt signals of trust. Every movement, every pause, was an opportunity to understand the rules of social negotiation and loyalty. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1914, Italian-American communities in Brooklyn were developing tightly knit networks that served both social and economic functions. Mutual trust was essential, and influence depended as much on discretion and reputation as on action. Local figures who commanded attention often did so through subtle displays of control and reliability rather than overt displays of force. Law enforcement remained inconsistent, and the ability to navigate these networks required acute perception and social acumen. Salvatore had begun to recognize these patterns and the importance of cultivating relationships that provided both guidance and protection. Understanding that alliances could shape opportunity and access in ways that mere effort alone could not. There's a story that he began to spend time in quiet corners, observing older, influential figures and learning their rhythms. He listened more than he spoke, noting how deference and subtle acknowledgement could cultivate trust and loyalty. Small gestures, a nod, a measured glance, a discreet offering of assistance became instruments of influence. Salvatore's awareness of timing and perception allowed him to integrate into networks without drawing unnecessary attention, creating a quiet reputation for reliability and insight. Many people still think that strategic alliances are formed only through visible negotiation. So, what do you think? Could silent observation, patience, and subtle reciprocity produce bonds that endure longer than any spoken contract? At home, his mother and father continued their steady routines, providing structure and stability against the restless energy of the neighborhood. Salvatore absorbed both environments, the disciplined order of family life and the nuanced, often opaque currents of street society. Psychologically, this period developed an early understanding of reciprocity, trust, and loyalty. He began to anticipate needs, notice unspoken expectations, and adjust his actions to foster mutual advantage. There's a story that he would quietly assess situations before acting, measuring both potential gains and the subtle costs of missteps. Developing a keen sense of strategic patience, the streets themselves offered continuous lessons. Vendors moved with practiced care, men navigated daily routines with precision, and occasional disputes were resolved without spectacle through small, deliberate interventions. Many people still think that influence is always visible and immediate. So, what do you think? Could the soft power of discretion, attention, and timing be more effective than overt display? Salvatore learned that the quiet management of relationships, the subtle cultivation of trust, and the careful alignment with key figures were as essential as any action. Each interaction, carefully noted, reinforced patterns that would later define his capacity for organization and command. As twilight descended, the neighborhood softened under the amber glow of gas lamps, shadows stretching along walls and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, settling into the rhythm of observation and quiet participation. The whispered corners, subtle acknowledgments, and carefully nurtured relationships were not merely incidental, they were the early scaffolding of influence. Alliances and the understanding of loyalty as a living, negotiated force. The warmth of home, combined with the subtle education of the streets, created a duality that sharpened perception while grounding him in routine and reflection. The late spring sun filtered through Brooklyn's crowded streets, softening the edges of brick tenements and casting long, narrow shadows along worn sidewalks. Salvatore Luciano, now 18, moved with a deliberate awareness, noting the faint patterns of foot traffic, the timing of shop closures, and the subtle ways neighbors acknowledged each other without words. Many people still think that control over a space requires visible dominance or assertion. So, what do you think? Could understanding, patience, and careful observation quietly delineate influence without the need for overt confrontation? The city itself seemed to breathe with hidden rhythms, vendors exchanging glances, children racing along alleys, and men pausing briefly to nod in tacit acknowledgement of unspoken authority. Each moment, each shadowed gesture, carried a lesson in presence and perception. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1915, Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods were densely packed, often interlaced with informal networks of trust and influence. Local strongmen maintained authority not solely through physical power, but through the strategic management of relationships, reputation, and knowledge of daily patterns. Police presence was inconsistent, leaving room for those who could map the streets with precision and discretion. Salvatore, through years of careful observation, had begun to internalize these patterns, mentally noting territories, points of influence, and the subtle markers that defined social hierarchies. He recognized that true understanding of a neighborhood relied on quiet attention, timing, and the integration of street knowledge with interpersonal awareness. There's a story that he would walk early in the morning, tracing routes through alleys, noting where shadows pooled, where conversations lingered, and where influence seemed concentrated. Small gestures, a respectful nod, a measured smile, an unspoken acknowledgement served as silent communication, signaling comprehension of the neighborhood's delicate social fabric. Many people still think that territorial understanding is learned through confrontation. So, what do you think? Could a careful study of patterns, observation of human behavior, and quiet integration provide a more enduring form of authority? Salvatore's mind catalogued interactions, distances, and timings, constructing a mental map of both physical and social spaces, a blueprint for influence built on attention rather than force. At home, the structure of family life continued as a grounding force. Meals were predictable, conversations measured, and responsibilities clearly defined. Psychologically, this duality, the disciplined home environment and the dynamic streetscape, fostered adaptability, patience, and strategic thinking. Salvatore was learning that leadership, influence, and control often required a blend of observation, subtle action, and timing, balanced against the stability of consistent routines. There's a story that he often spent hours reflecting on movements, gestures, and interactions, analyzing potential outcomes and internalizing patterns of compliance. Respect and trust. The streets themselves offered continuous lessons in rhythm and negotiation. Shopkeepers adjusted displays with subtle attention. Neighbors exchanged minimal gestures, and minor disputes dissolved under quiet influence rather than public confrontation. Many people still think that dominance manifests only through force. So, what do you think? Could influence and respect be cultivated through subtle presence, careful observation, and the measured application of attention? Salvatore's awareness allowed him to anticipate reactions, adjust approaches, and navigate both physical and social landscapes with precision, translating perception into quiet authority. As evening descended, the warm light softened across brick facades, long shadows stretching along alleys and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, absorbing the lessons embedded in these streets. The importance of timing, the subtle negotiation of presence, and the quiet understanding of influence as a living, dynamic force. The apartment above the butcher shop welcomed him with warmth, the faint aroma of supper mingling with the stability of domestic routine. Shadows had become guides, streets a living classroom, and each silent observation a building block of strategic comprehension. The heavy warmth of summer settled over Brooklyn, and the late afternoon sun slanted through the narrow streets, casting elongated shadows across the worn cobblestones and brick facades. Salvatore Lucania, now 19, moved with a quiet deliberation, attuned to the rhythms of the neighborhood he had long observed. Many people still think that loyalty and influence are demanded through command or overt demonstration. So, what do you think? Could allegiance be cultivated more subtly, through consistency, observation, and discreet attention to relationships? The city itself murmured with instruction, merchants adjusting wares with unspoken rhythm, neighbors exchanging brief nods of acknowledgement, and men carrying authority without spectacle, their influence woven into gestures, timing, and quiet expectation. Each shadowed corner, each whispered glance, offered lessons in human behavior and the architecture of trust. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1916, Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods had begun to develop more structured networks of mutual reliance and loyalty, precursors to the organized circles that would dominate local affairs in the coming decades. Law enforcement remained inconsistent, leaving informal systems of respect and influence to thrive. Salvatore, through careful observation and incremental participation, began establishing a loyal group of peers, those who recognized his reliability, discretion, and attentiveness. These early allegiances were foundational, not forged through spectacle or coercion, but through a careful calibration of trust, timing, and understanding of human dynamics. There's a story that he would spend evenings in quiet meeting spots, observing interactions and subtly inserting himself into trusted circles. Small acts, discreet favor, an attentive listening ear, a carefully timed word signaled his awareness and reliability. Many people still think that leadership or authority is displayed through loud actions or confrontation. So, what do you think? Could quiet competence, careful observation, and subtle reciprocity establish deeper and more enduring loyalty? Salvatore's efforts were deliberate yet unobtrusive. He cultivated relationships that acknowledged both the independence of others and the stability of his presence, creating bonds that were resilient, measured, and quietly influential at home. The rhythm of family life continued to provide grounding. Meals, conversation, and domestic routine offered a predictable anchor against the dynamic and unpredictable currents of the streets. Psychologically, this dual environment structured domesticity and fluid street dynamics sharpened Salvatore's capacity for strategic patience, careful observation, and nuanced social interaction. There's a story that he would reflect on the alignment between influence and loyalty, noting which actions fostered genuine trust and which left gaps or tensions. He began to appreciate that allegiance was rarely instantaneous. It was cultivated incrementally, like the careful layering of bricks in a foundation, each gesture and decision reinforcing the structure beneath. The streets themselves were rich with subtle instruction. Vendors and neighbors enacted daily patterns that carried meaning, and minor disagreements were resolved not through spectacle, but through negotiation, observation, and measured influence. Many people still think that control or loyalty is enforced primarily through dominance. So, what do you think? Could careful attention to timing, subtle gestures, and the quiet management of presence foster a more enduring and resilient structure of support? Salvatore's mind catalogued these patterns, translating observation into understanding, and understanding into quiet authority. As dusk fell, the light softened, gilding the facades of tenements and stretching shadows across alleys and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, letting the day's lessons settle into his consciousness. The value of patience, the careful cultivation of trust, and the subtle architecture of human networks. The apartment above the butcher shop welcomed him with warmth, faint aromas of evening meals mingling with the comfort of routine. Shadows had become teachers, the streets a living classroom, and each observation a building block of influence, loyalty, and quiet command. The humid haze of late summer hung over Brooklyn, softening the edges of brick tenements and muting the clatter of carts along narrow streets. Salvatore Lucania, now 21, moved with a quiet authority, his presence noted in subtle nods and careful glances exchanged among neighbors and local figures. Many people still think that power manifests only through force or loud display. So, what do you think? Could influence emerge more enduringly from discretion, observation, and the careful orchestration of relationships? The streets themselves seemed to breathe with instruction, merchants adjusting wares in practiced rhythm, men moving with silent assurance, children aware of subtle hierarchies even in play. Each gesture, each pause, was a lesson in timing, perception, and the unspoken currents that structured social dominance. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1917, the Italian-American communities of Brooklyn were coalescing under emerging figures who combined strategic foresight, careful alliances, and keen observation to exert influence. Law enforcement, constrained by limited resources and occasionally compromised by corruption, was often reactive rather than proactive, leaving room for individuals like Salvatore to expand their reach and consolidate networks of support. Through careful cultivation of loyalty and strategic partnerships, he had begun to exert authority quietly but unmistakably, commanding respect through presence, discretion, and reliability rather than overt coercion. There's a story that he began managing small operations under the guidance of older, seasoned figures, learning the intricacies of coordination, negotiation, and subtle oversight. Salvatore observed meticulously, understanding the balance between visible action and behind-the-scenes influence. Many people still think that leadership depends primarily on public assertion. So, what do you think? Could true command be achieved by managing the unseen currents of trust, expectation, and subtle authority? He became adept at reading gestures, anticipating reactions, and directing the flow of interactions without drawing attention to his hand in the process. At home, routines remained grounding anchors. Meals, the faint clatter of dishes, and his parents' measured guidance contrasted with the dynamic, often unpredictable currents of neighborhood life. Psychologically, this period solidified Salvatore's understanding of duality, the necessity of measured observation and quiet action in public life, balanced against the stability and predictability of private existence. There's a story that he frequently reflected on these contrasts, noting how influence and authority could be exercised with subtlety, patience, and strategic insight rather than through spectacle. The mental discipline required to navigate multiple spheres of power became second nature, forming the foundation for the complex orchestration of loyalty and operations. The streets themselves were living laboratories. Vendors arranged goods with precision, minor disputes dissolved quietly, and familiar figures moved with an unspoken rhythm that signaled hierarchy and trust. Many people still think that dominance is enforced by visibility and confrontation alone. So, what do you think? Could subtle competence, attention to timing, and a keen understanding of human behavior produce authority more enduring than overt displays of power. Salvatore integrated these lessons, observing, reflecting, and intervening only when necessary, cultivating influence as a living, dynamic architecture. The early winter air pressed softly against Brooklyn's brick facades, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke and the distant murmur of street vendors closing their stalls. Salvatore Lucania, now 24, moved with an assured calm, each step deliberate, each glance measured, navigating a neighborhood that seemed to pulse with invisible currents. Many people still think that power is always visible, manifesting through loud assertion or spectacle. So, what do you think? Could authority exist quietly, maintained through observation, strategic alignment, and the careful orchestration of relationships? The streets themselves offered instruction, gestures noted and returned, pauses in conversation laden with meaning, and familiar figures moving in measured patterns of recognition and deference. Each subtle interaction reinforced an unspoken hierarchy, the architecture of influence constructed in shadowed increments. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1920, the Italian-American networks of Brooklyn were entering a period of expansion and consolidation, with emerging figures exercising influence across multiple neighborhoods. Economic conditions remained challenging, law enforcement uneven, and the landscape of loyalty and trust highly fluid. Salvatore, having established himself through careful observation, reliability, and strategic alliances, now oversaw multiple operations and maintained a growing network of devoted associates. Authority was rarely asserted through confrontation. It emerged instead from the careful coordination of loyalty, trust, and subtle negotiation. There's a story that he would spend evenings reviewing arrangements, considering each individual's reliability, timing interventions, and ensuring that alliances remained aligned with both strategy and discretion. Many people still think that leadership is demonstrated through direct action or visible control. So, what do you think? Could influence and command be sustained through attention to detail, the management of relationships, and the quiet orchestration of human behavior? Salvatore's approach combined foresight, patience, and the subtle recognition of both opportunity and risk, creating a network that was resilient, adaptive, and quietly powerful. At home, routines offered contrast and grounding. Meals, conversation, and domestic rhythms provided stability against the fluidity and complexity of the streets. Psychologically, this duality honed a capacity for reflection, anticipation, and measured decision-making. There's a story that he often considered the subtle motivations of associates, evaluating trust, predicting reactions, and refining approaches to both influence and loyalty. Each interaction was considered not only in its immediate context, but also in its broader contribution to the structure of his growing authority. The streets themselves functioned as living classrooms. Vendors arranged goods with careful precision. Minor disputes dissolved quietly, and social cues carried meaning beyond the words spoken. Many people still think that influence is always confrontational or public. So, what do you think? Could the careful observation of subtle gestures, the management of expectation, and strategic placement of attention cultivate authority more enduring than any overt display? Salvatore internalized these lessons, allowing him to anticipate needs, maintain influence, and navigate both allies and potential threats with quiet mastery. As dusk fell, amber light softened against tenements, shadows stretching long across alleys, and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, letting the day's lessons settle into the mind. The subtle orchestration of influence, the careful management of loyalty, and the quiet architecture of command. The apartment above the butcher shop exuded warmth, the faint aroma of evening meals mingling with the reassurance of domestic continuity. Shadows had become mentors, streets a living laboratory, and each interaction a deliberate stroke in the growing canvas of authority. The first frost of winter glazed Brooklyn's streets with a pale, brittle sheen, muting footsteps and softening the familiar rhythms of alleyways and tenements. Salvatore Lucania, now 25, moved with heightened awareness, sensing the subtle shifts in behavior among neighbors and acquaintances, noticing the cautious glances and the measured hesitations that hinted at changing dynamics. Many people still think that pressure from authority is sudden, marked by overt confrontation. So, what do you think? Could the subtle accumulation of attention, surveillance, and scrutiny create a quiet tension that alters behavior long before formal intervention? The city itself seemed to murmur warnings. Vendors closing slightly earlier, familiar figures moving with deliberate care, and shadows stretching longer in the fading winter light. Each shift, each hesitation, carried instruction for those who were alert enough to notice. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1921, law enforcement in Brooklyn and wider New York was increasingly aware of the rising influence of organized Italian-American figures. Investigations were often painstaking, relying on observation, informants, and the careful piecing together of fragmented evidence. Resources were constrained, and officers frequently had to prioritize overt criminal activity over subtle networks of influence. Salvatore, ascending steadily, now faced the early echoes of scrutiny, sensing that every interaction, every decision could be observed, interpreted, and potentially leveraged against him. Awareness of these pressures required not only vigilance, but careful management of visibility, timing, and discretion. There's a story that he began to notice small changes among associates' delays, uncertain glances, and the occasional avoidance of routine meetings, interpreted these as early signals of potential compromise. Many people still think that the threat of investigation is always loud or disruptive. So, what do you think? Could the quiet anticipation of scrutiny, the careful adjustment of behavior, and the subtle realignment of relationships provide both protection and foresight? Salvatore's growing understanding of surveillance and external pressure shaped his routines, his interactions, and his strategies, emphasizing patience, subtlety, and foresight over reaction and confrontation at home. The quiet domestic routines offered both reflection and sanctuary. Meals, soft conversation, and the warmth of family life contrasted with the tension of external observation, providing psychological stability. There's a story that he spent long hours in contemplation, weighing the implications of scrutiny, assessing vulnerabilities, and planning adjustments that maintained both influence and security. This period developed a duality of perception, the necessity of observing others while simultaneously monitoring oneself, cultivating a layered awareness that guided decisions with measured caution. The streets themselves became lessons in vigilance. Small gestures, delayed greetings, and minor inconsistencies carried meaning. Even casual conversations were observed for nuance. Many people still think that pressure from authorities or rivals is always overt. So, what do you think? Could the accumulation of subtle cues, observed with attention and interpreted carefully, shape behavior, preempt conflict, and influence outcomes more effectively than any single dramatic intervention. Salvatore's heightened perception allowed him to adjust, anticipate, and maintain influence quietly, navigating early scrutiny without disruption, integrating vigilance into the fabric of daily operations. As evening descended, amber light faded into the soft gray of winter twilight, stretching shadows across alleys, stoops, and narrow streets. Salvatore exhaled, allowing the lessons of the Datha, subtle awareness of observation, the management of scrutiny, and the quiet orchestration of precaution to settle in his mind. The apartment above the butcher shop provided warmth, aromas of evening meals mingling with the soft comfort of routine. Shadows became guides, streets a living classroom, and each observed detail, a component of a carefully managed response to emerging pressure. The brittle cold of midwinter clung to Brooklyn, frosting the edges of tenements and cobblestones with a quiet austerity. Salvatore Lucania, now 26, moved with cautious deliberation, noting the subtle hesitations, sidelong glances, and abrupt shifts in demeanor among those around him. Many people still think that betrayal is sudden, explosive, and impossible to foresee. So, what do you think? Could disloyalty emerge quietly through whispered conversations, missed meetings, and the accumulation of small deviations from expectation? The streets themselves seemed to murmur warnings, shadows lengthening oddly, familiar gestures misaligned, and the faintest changes in routine suggesting that not all was as it seemed. Each observation added layers to a growing awareness of fragile alliances and the complexities of loyalty. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1922, organized Italian-American networks in Brooklyn were both expanding and increasingly vulnerable to internal fractures. Informants, rivalries, and opportunistic associates created an environment where trust had to be continually reassessed. Law enforcement continued to develop methods of surveillance and intelligence gathering, applying pressure not only from the outside but exploiting cracks within emerging organizations. Salvatore, attuned to these dynamics, had to navigate both ambition and treachery, learning that influence required not only careful orchestration but also a constant evaluation of loyalty and reliability. There's a story that he noticed subtle anomalies among trusted associates, conversations avoided, meetings delayed, and slight evasions that suggested shifting intentions. Many people still think that betrayal announces itself with dramatic confrontation. So, what do you think? Could careful observation, attentiveness to nuance, and preemptive adjustment allow one to recognize disloyalty before it becomes destructive? Salvatore internalized these lessons, approaching relationships with measured caution, verifying trust through repeated interaction, and subtly restructuring networks to ensure continuity and stability. At home, the measured patterns of domestic life provided grounding against the mounting tension outside. Meals, conversation, and routine offered both comfort and a mirror for reflection. Psychologically, this period reinforced Salvatore's acute awareness of human motivation, the contradictions between spoken loyalty and unspoken intent, the interplay of ambition, fear, and self-interest. There's a story that he would quietly reflect on each interaction, weighing intention against action, and developing an internal map of trust that guided decisions, mitigated risk, and preserved influence. The streets themselves became silent instructors. Vendors' gestures, neighbors' greetings, and the subtle choreography of daily life carried hidden meaning. Many people still think that threats from within are always loud and unmistakable. So, what do you think? Could betrayal be most dangerous? Precisely because it is quiet, concealed within ordinary patterns, and emerging incrementally. Salvatore's attentiveness to these cues allowed him to adapt, anticipate, and reassert control without disturbance, managing loyalty and influence with careful discretion. As dusk descended, the waning winter light softened the streets into muted grays, stretching shadows across alleys and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, absorbing the lessons of subtle treachery, the importance of vigilance, and the delicate management of trust. The apartment above the butcher shop provided warmth, aromas of evening meals blending with domestic continuity. Shadows became guides, the streets a living classroom, and each observed nuance, a building block in the careful preservation of alliances. The sharp clarity of late winter light cut across Brooklyn streets, glinting off frost-laced cobblestones and iron railings. Salvatore Lucania, now 27, moved with a quiet vigilance, aware of the heightened attention that had begun to press from both external authorities and internal scrutiny. Many people still think that legal pressure is always immediate, loud, and dramatic. So, what do you think? Could the weight of observation, investigation, and slow accumulation of evidence create a subtle tension that shapes behavior long before formal confrontation? The city itself seemed to pulse with careful observation. Vendors closing slightly earlier, neighbors exchanging measured words, and familiar figures carrying themselves with conscious restraint. Each interaction, each hesitation, suggested the growing presence of forces poised to test the resilience of loyalty and discretion. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1923, law enforcement in Brooklyn and across New York was intensifying investigative techniques aimed at organized Italian-American networks. Surveillance, informants, and piece-together intelligence created an environment where careful navigation was essential. Salvatore's influence, once exercised largely through discretion and observation, now faced the scrutiny of both legal apparatus and emerging internal fractures. Success required not only strategic foresight but also meticulous attention to reputation, timing, and relational alignment. There's a story that he began attending meetings with heightened caution, weighing every word, every gesture, and observing the smallest discrepancies in demeanor. Many people still think that courtroom and investigative pressure always erupts violently or visibly. So, what do you think? Could the quiet, pervasive tension of looming legal challenge alter behavior, sharpen strategy, and demand subtle adaptation? Salvatore's approach was measured. He monitored associates, adjusted routines, and refined the internal structure of his operations, maintaining influence while minimizing exposure. The psychological burden of potential betrayal and legal challenge demanded constant vigilance, patience, and nuanced decision-making at home. Domestic routines provided continuity and a safe harbor. Meals, soft conversation, and the warmth of family spaces offered reflection and recalibration. Psychologically, this period emphasized the duality of public scrutiny and private grounding. There's a story that he would review the day's interactions in careful contemplation, noting discrepancies, recalibrating trust, and mentally rehearsing responses to potential pressure. Each encounter became an exercise in observation. Each word and gesture evaluated for both immediate and long-term significance. Reinforcing his capacity for strategic foresight, the streets themselves became classrooms of subtle instruction. Vendors, neighbors, and acquaintances communicated volumes through minimal gestures. Even the quietest interactions contained potential signals of loyalty or caution. Many people still think that the lessons of legal pressure are dramatic and visible. So, what do you think? Could the careful attention to nuance, observation of patterns, and anticipation of consequences provide an enduring advantage over reactive response? Salvatore internalized these lessons, using observation to guide decisions, preserve loyalty, and maintain influence without attracting unnecessary attention. As dusk fell, amber light softened into the muted grays of approaching evening, shadows stretching long across alleys and stoops. Salvatore exhaled, allowing the day's reflections, the subtle management of observation, trust, and external pressure to settle into consciousness. The apartment above the butcher shop offered warmth, aromas of evening meals blending with domestic continuity. Shadows became mentors, streets a living laboratory, and each interaction a deliberate stone in the architecture of resilience and strategic adaptation. The winter wind swept through Brooklyn streets with a quiet insistence, bending bare branches against frosted tenements and carrying the faint scent of coal smoke from distant chimneys. Salvatore Lucania, now 28, moved with subdued determination, aware of the culmination of pressures both from law enforcement and the fragile loyalties that shaped his world. Many people still think that the moment of judgment is sudden, marked by clamor and spectacle. So, what do you think? Could consequences arrive as a quiet, relentless accumulation of observation, evidence, and the slow unraveling of carefully maintained influence? The city itself seemed to whisper. Doors closed with slightly more care, voices softened, and shadows lengthened with the anticipation of change. Each footfall, each glance, carried the weight of emerging reckoning. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1924, law enforcement's persistence in prosecuting rising figures within Brooklyn's Italian-American networks had intensified, employing structured investigations, witness testimony, and strategic observation. Trials were elaborate, requiring meticulous presentation of evidence and careful negotiation of legal nuance. Salvatore, having built a network of subtle authority and careful alliances, now faced the tangible manifestation of legal scrutiny. Influence, cultivated over years, was measured against the procedural weight of law, and the delicate balance between loyalty and vulnerability became sharply apparent. There's a story that he approached the courtroom and formal proceedings with measured composure, observing behaviors, noting gestures, and listening to pauses in speech as carefully as he had once monitored the streets. Many people still think that legal reckoning is only external, but so, what do you think? Could internalized preparation, observation, and reflection allow one to navigate formal judgment with steadiness, even when outcomes hang uncertain? Salvatore's strategies relied not on confrontation or defiance, but on patience, understanding, and a quiet adaptation to the rhythm of proceedings. He recognized that influence and survival depended on nuanced comprehension of both human behavior and institutional mechanics. At home, the residual warmth of domestic routine provided psychological refuge: meals, soft conversation, and familiar patterns of evening life contrasted with the tension of trials and scrutiny, offering grounding and calm. Psychologically, this period emphasized reflection, strategic awareness, and measured control over emotional response. There's a story that he spent quiet hours reviewing interactions, statements, and potential vulnerabilities, refining approaches to maintain dignity, mitigate exposure, and preserve as much influence as possible. Each decision, each gesture, became an extension of mental discipline cultivated over years of subtle observation and management. The streets themselves, now quieter under the pale winter light, offered lessons in anticipation and resilience. Minor gestures, shifts in routine, and small deviations from expectation served as ongoing reminders of the fragile balance between authority and accountability. Many people still think that the consequences of one's actions are always dramatic. So, what do you think? Could careful observation, reflective adaptation, and psychological foresight prepare one to endure and navigate the slow unfolding of judgment? Salvatore integrated these lessons, maintaining composure and insight, allowing each nuanced understanding to shape responses and protect the enduring structure of his influence. Even as external circumstances tightened, as evening settled, the amber and grey light softened into a winter twilight, stretching long shadows across alleys, stoops, and closed storefronts. Salvatore exhaled, allowing the weight of the day, the subtle pressures of observation, and the culmination of scrutiny to settle gently into his mind. The apartment above the butcher shop provided warmth, aromas of evening meals blending with the reassuring constancy of domestic life. Shadows became mentors, the streets a living classroom, and each interaction a carefully considered element in the navigation of consequence and restraint. The heavy iron of the prison gates closed with a dull, resonant finality, sending a shiver through the cold January air. Salvatore Lucania, now 29, felt the weight of years and choices pressing gently into his shoulders as he stepped into the courtyard, the muffled clatter of distant footsteps echoing against stone walls. Many people still think that prison life is loud, chaotic, and unrelentingly harsh. So, what do you think? Could confinement be a quiet teacher, shaping awareness, patience, and internal discipline through stillness, routine, and observation? The yard itself offered lessons, men moving in predictable patterns, conversations unfolding in careful tones, and the muted rhythm of life within walls, serving as both structure and mirror. Each footfall, each glance, each whispered interaction became a subtle component in understanding the balance of control, influence, and self-preservation. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By 1929, Sing Sing and other New York State penitentiaries were organized with strict routines, from labor assignments to regimented meal schedules. Guards observed movements closely, communication was constrained, and access to the outside world was limited. Yet these limitations fostered a unique form of social negotiation among inmates. Salvatore, having spent years orchestrating networks on the streets, now navigated the constrained yet complex social ecosystem within prison walls. Influence was subtle, relying on observation, discretion, and the careful cultivation of respect through behavior, conversation, and adherence to tacit codes. There's a story that he began mapping the courtyard in his mind, noting alliances, behavioral patterns, and social hierarchies. Many people still think that power is meaningless behind bars. So, what do you think? Could authority, patience, and psychological insight manifest even within confinement, shaping relationships and creating subtle influence that endures? Salvatore's approach was deliberate, listening more than speaking, observing more than acting, and learning the rhythms of human behavior within these walls. Psychological discipline became as crucial as physical adaptation, reinforcing the careful management of presence, perception, and trust at night. The quiet of the cells offered both reflection and subdued comfort, The clatter of distant keys, the soft murmur of men settling, and the faint aroma of institutional meals provided a backdrop for introspection. Psychologically, this period reinforced resilience, strategic awareness, and the subtle art of patience. There's a story that he would spend hours contemplating decisions, interactions, and the long-term consequences of both action and inaction, refining mental strategies as carefully as he once arranged operations on the streets. Each thought, each observation, each silent interaction contributed to the quiet mastery of adaptation and endurance. The routines of the prison itself became teachers. Early mornings marked by muted bells, labor with meticulous observation, and meals that were both sustenance and ritual. Many people still think that learning stops behind walls. So, what do you think? Could careful attention to detail, deliberate patience, and measured reflection cultivate insight, influence, and internal authority even under confinement? Salvatore internalized these lessons, using observation and adaptation to navigate relationships, anticipate needs, and subtly shape the rhythm of communal life, maintaining dignity and influence quietly, without overt assertion. As evening descended, amber light filtered through barred windows, casting long shadows across stone floors and narrow walkways. Salvatore exhaled, letting the day's reflections, the subtle management of relationships, observation of behavior, and cultivation of mental resilience settle gently into consciousness. The courtyard's stillness became a canvas, the patterns of human behavior a silent guide, and the architecture of confinement a structure for introspection and quiet mastery. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the high, barred windows, casting elongated shadows across the cold stone floors of the prison. Salvatore Lucania, now in his early 50s, moved slowly through the narrow corridors, each step measured, each breath deliberate. Many people still think that age behind bars merely diminishes vitality. So, what do you think? Could the passage of time deepen awareness, reflection, and a quieter understanding of influence and consequence? The corridors themselves seemed to exhale history, echoes of footsteps long gone, faint murmurs of distant conversations, and the subtle scent of institutional routine lingering like a soft memory. Each measured movement, each observed gesture, carried significance, contributing to an internal rhythm of adaptation and quiet contemplation. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By the early 1940s, Salvatore Lucania, formerly Charles Lucky Luciano, had been transferred to several correctional facilities, including the harsh routines of Danny. Prison administration had become more regimented, yet opportunities for strategic social observation remained. As inmates navigated hierarchical structures within constrained environments, Salvatore, now older, applied the same meticulous attention to human behavior that had once guided his ascent on Brooklyn streets. Influence and authority persisted quietly, expressed through respect, subtle negotiation, and measured interaction rather than overt assertion. There's a story that he would watch younger inmates, noting patterns of ambition, caution, and trust, often guiding them through silent gestures and quiet interventions. Many people still think that aging diminishes insight or capability. So, what do you think? Could decades of experience, reflection, and observation foster a deeper, almost serene understanding of human dynamics, even within confinement? Salvatore's approach became one of mentorship, careful evaluation, and patient influence, shaping the internal culture of his surroundings without drawing attention. Psychological discipline, cultivated over decades, reinforced resilience, foresight, and an almost meditative understanding of loyalty, fear, and ambition dot the small routines of prison life. Meals, chores, and confined social interactions became both anchor and canvas for reflection. Psychologically, this period emphasized patience, strategic adaptation, and the acceptance of limits. There's a story that he would spend hours quietly considering past decisions, their outcomes, and the lessons embedded within each choice, revisiting the intricate architecture of influence he had built and maintaining mental acuity despite confinement. Each interaction, however subtle, was both a mirror and a test, allowing him to preserve dignity, awareness, and quiet authority. Evening brought the softened amber glow of lamps, illuminating the stone corridors and casting gentle shadows that shifted with the passage of time. Many people still think that life behind bars is purely restrictive and bleak. So, what do you think? Could the gradual slowing of physical movement and the elongation of observation foster a reflective, almost philosophical understanding of both self and society? Salvatore internalized these rhythms, translating them into calm reflection, deliberate awareness, and a patient understanding of human nature. The first light of dawn slipped weakly through the high prison windows, painting thin streaks of gold across the cold stone floor. Salvatore Lucania, now in the final years of his life, felt the weight of decades settle gently upon his shoulders, each memory a muted echo within the silent corridors. Many people still think that legacies are loud, celebrated, or immortalized in monuments. So, what do you think? Could influence and remembrance exist quietly through the subtle marks left on others, the lives shaped, and the networks forged long ago? The prison walls exhaled history, a soft witness to endurance, reflection, and the careful navigation of human ambition. Each step, each pause, each measured breath was a meditation on both the life lived and the impact quietly sustained. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. By the early 1960s, Luciano had been released from prison on the condition of deportation, living the remainder of his years in Naples. His influence on organized crime, the codification of rules among criminal networks, and the structure of strategic alliances persisted long after his absence from Brooklyn's streets, even separated from the neighborhoods he once commanded. His methodologies and philosophies were transmitted through associates, reshaping the environment he had once directly navigated. History remembers him not only for actions but for the enduring frameworks he created. There's a story that even in exile, he remained attentive to developments within the networks he had built, providing guidance through letters and trusted intermediaries. Many people still think that absence erases authority. So, what do you think? Could the careful transmission of knowledge, observation, and instruction sustain influence beyond physical presence? Salvatore's legacy was quiet but profound, built upon patience, foresight, and a deliberate cultivation of trust and procedural order that outlasted his immediate visibility. Psychologically, this period emphasized reflection, humility, and the soft power of enduring structures rather than the dramatic assertion of dominance. In Naples, life moved differently. The scent of the sea mingled with city smoke, narrow streets hummed with gentle activity, and the rhythms of daily life offered a contrast to decades of structured observation behind bars. Psychologically, these years provided the opportunity to reconcile past choices, reflect on human nature, and observe the consequences of influence carried forward. There's a story that he often walked along quiet streets at dusk, observing the ebb and flow of life, considering patterns of loyalty, ambition, and human desire. Much as he had once done in Brooklyn, now tempered by years of reflection and age, the lessons of power, trust, and human behavior had become internalized, expressed in calm observation rather than overt action. Many people still think that legacies are built only in youth through dramatic feats. So, what do you think? Could the quiet, sustained application of insight, careful cultivation of relationships, and deliberate thought shape worlds even after direct engagement ceases? Salvatore embodied this principle, his influence resonating through the structures he had shaped, guiding behavior and decisions with an almost invisible hand. As evening fell, the Naples skyline softened beneath the descending twilight, shadows stretching across narrow alleyways, rooftops, and quiet piazzas. Salvatore exhaled, letting the weight of years, the reflections on influence, and the enduring resonance of decisions settle gently into consciousness. Life had become a study in observation, patience, and the enduring architecture of human interaction. The soft hum of distant activity, the gentle lapping of water against the harbor, and the shifting shadows of twilight provided a serene backdrop for reflection, introspection, and a gradual release of tension. By nightfall, the city murmured, in muted rhythm, distant footsteps, shutters closing, and the gentle sigh of evening wind through narrow streets. Salvatore lay in repose, the patterns of influence, reflection, and enduring legacy folding quietly into consciousness. Settle now, breathe, soften, and allow the gentle cadence of Naples evenings, the quiet weight of accumulated wisdom, and the soft embrace of shadowed streets to fold around the mind, encouraging calm, reflection, and restful sleep.